Hey everyone, it's Mike coming at you from my treatment room. Just finished seeing patients for the day, and I thought I would do a quick video for any of my colleagues in physical medicine who might sometimes get frustrated by online discussions of science in our field. You know, if you're like me, it can be kind of exhausting to scroll down a comment thread and witness a preponderance of people talking past each other and generally failing to come to some coherent understanding. I have a little bit of compassion around this just because, hey, it's a new thing we're trying and none of us quite knows how to do this internet thing yet. But another source of solace is to view these discussions in a larger historical context, to view this as part of the normal evolution of science in our field. And helping me in that perspective is a wonderful book by a strange and wonderful man. This book is called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and it's by Thomas Kuhn. It was written in '62. And if you're interested at all in the history of science, I highly recommend this book. Let me give you a few notes and how it might pertain to our current state in physical medicine. So here's my contention based kind of on Kuhn. Physical medicine right now is in a crisis. And I would contend that's a good thing. It's in a crisis around what causes pain and dysfunction in our patients. We are in a crisis around how we might cause or contribute to people's recovery. We are in a crisis when it comes to how we should best interact with our patients and each other, and a number of other things. So we're in crisis, and instead of wringing our hands over that fact, we should do our best to navigate it, to surf that wave, because crisis is a thing that happens to any vital scientific field. It's a part of the growth process of a science. Now, let me give you a little bit of context for what Kuhn was responding to with this book. If we think about science and the understanding of science in the late 1800s, it was kind of a free-for-all. You know, we see the term science get used in a lot of ways that we wouldn't really recognize in today's parlance. We see terms like Christian Science or Nietzsche saying the gay science, right? These are terms that don't fit into our modern understanding of scientific activity. That understanding really came into the fore post-World War I. And a major force in that was the positivists. They came up with a bunch of principles for how science and the investigation of our world should proceed. Positivists were really the folks who helped us understand falsifiability, how to come up with a claim that could be tested, right? It helped us understand how to navigate around potential biases and confounds. And so this is what we refer to nowadays when we have arguments around critical thinking, stuff like that. That really came into the fore in the early part of the 20th century. But one effect of that discussion, how science should work, is that people began to have an idea that that is how science has worked, right? So in the 40s and 50s, we had this image of the scientist and of scientific progress as this stately march where, you know, over centuries we gradually uncovered more of nature's mysteries, and occasionally there were some wackos around the periphery that prevented our progress, but we've forged on and finally came to the truth. But the truth is that science is not like that in the context of history. Science is embedded within history. And Kuhn and others of his kind in the 60s began to investigate the evolution of science within history and within culture. And what they found when they looked at it was that science always has a cultural element, always has sort of an effect by the people doing it, right? And the kind of biases they have. So there's a way that science should work, and there's a way that it actually evolves over time. And that's a lot of the frustration we see in these Facebook discussions, right? So here's a little bit of Kuhnian terminology for you, and maybe this would give some insight. First of all, there's one kind of science Kuhn talks about called normal science. And this is when one dominant paradigm exists, one way of seeing the world that is able to explain pretty much everything we see. And parts of normal science you will recognize. such as extending the theory into new nooks and crannies of the natural world, such as refining methods of measurement, such as testing different predictions. So kind of like, okay, we predict this, now we test this, and it didn't or did accord with prediction. And developing applications, technology, methodologies, etc. That's normal science. That's when there's one paradigm dominant, and the work of science is extending the power of that paradigm. But a natural consequence of this is that people become expert enough, precise enough to begin to detect anomaly, right? Dun, 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 anomaly. And when an anomaly happens, the architecture of normal science begins to investigate it, right? And that's a normal thing too. Most of the time, resolution happens post-anomaly. Why? Because the questions get clarified and the claims get retested, and most of the time, things resolve back to normal science. But every once in a while, an anomaly sticks around, and the best scientists in the world can't make it go away. And this could go on for centuries. This could go on for many generations of scientists, an anomaly just sticking around, and maybe people ignore it, maybe people talk about it, but basically it grows and sticks in there like a fly in the ointment until we have a full-blown crisis. And a crisis is defined by competing paradigms. That's to say, science still exists, science is still vital and healthy, but it's not characterized by one major paradigm. It's characterized by a series of competing paradigms. Not just competing individuals, but even within one individual, different paradigms will compete, right? So what characterizes a crisis? Well, one thing is that the theories we have are incomplete and they kind of overlap, right? So if you're a practitioner of physical medicine and you notice yourself kind of switching between modalities or switching between theories of what's going on with your patient, that's because no one theory suffices. You are having to jump between paradigms. It's happening in you every day in your practice, a crisis, right? Segmented thinking. Similarly, we find ourselves kind of explaining things based on numerous causes. So in the curriculum of most of our schooling, we had to kind of list out different effects we're having and thus try to explain the effects of our manual therapy or our therapeutic exercise based on a whole bunch of potential causalities. Why? Because the body is complex. We don't know the real cause yet. We just have to theorize, right? Segmented thinking. Predictions are often hard to test in physical medicine. So a lot of the stuff that we kind of have a hunch about, boy, it's just really tough to investigate. Imaging technology, maybe. Biomarkers, maybe. Clinical trials, maybe. But it turns out that not everything in nature is equally testable. And that's a feature of crisis science, right? Obviously, one thing that can happen with crisis science is a lot of cultural and cognitive discomfort. It's not always comfortable to exist in a field where there's a crisis science. But hey, that's the time in history that we find ourselves. So we need to do our best to push this thing forward. Speaking of pushing it forward, one key observation that Kuhn makes is that most of the time, people don't manage to update their brain's firmware within a single generation. What happens most of the time is that people don't get reformed. People get replaced. Generational change is the main driving force of crisis being resolved. So it could take many generations, but what happens is we have good and well-meaning teachers in our field, and they get kind of baked in with their own pet paradigms, and new students come up and they're still kind of embryonic and they take on their own paradigms. And this is where sort of competition and evolution happens, and hopefully over time people begin to tinker until A new theory begins to be successful in explaining most phenomena that are observed, and it begins to defeat competing paradigms. And so that new theory then becomes a dominant paradigm, and we return to something we might call normal science. Now, there's lots of responses to this Kuhnian concept, but and lots of implications for how we might navigate this at our best in physical medicine. Maybe I'll do another video on that. But for right now, I just want to zoom out and say, if you think that there's a lot of chaos happening right now in physical medicine, you are right. You're right. But it might be a natural and necessary part of the evolution of our field, and we should all just take a deep breath, get on that surfboard, and try to ride this wave, because here is where we are. I love you, and I hope you're having a nice day.